All right, so I'd like to take a couple minutes now and talk about methodological approaches in symbolic interaction. This one should be relatively brief, but I wanted to say a little bit more about the methodological approaches specific to symbolic interaction. And I think these are also true of some of the other areas of sociological social psychology as well. Um, the Especially the Chicago school, as I said, is a kind of um, approach that's kind of heavily invested in the use of ethnographic methodologies. Again, something that's borrowed from the field of anthropology. What we kind of engage in is something called naturalistic inquiry, which is research that's focused on people's behavior in existing or natural social settings. This is different than, say, experimentation. And again, if you look at the history of social psychology and you go back to the 1800s and you look at the German psychologist Wundt, right, one of the things that he sort of proposed was a kind of folk psychology, right? So a kind of what would become eventually social psychology originates as a kind of set of inquiries that are grounded in the everyday lives um, of people, as they kind of went about their day-to-day business. So this this naturalistic inquiry relies on kind of an informal and unobtrusive set of techniques that are designed to gain a kind of first-hand understanding of people's behavior, right? So we want to see people behaving in their everyday lives, right, in a sort of natural, non-laboratory, non-experimental sort of setting, because that's the way that people's lives kind of operate, right? We don't live in controlled environments. Remember, in an experiment, there are two groups of people. There's a control group and there's the experimental group. Both of those groups are composed of very, very similar kinds of people. The experimental group is exposed to some condition or set of conditions, and the control group is not. And then you compare the two groups after the experiment to see what possible differences exist, with the idea that the differences that exist in the experimental group are the result of having been exposed to the experimental condition, right? And again, that's a perfectly valid methodology for certain kinds of inquiry. But if your goal is to understand social behavior, you sort of need to immerse yourself in social environments and observe the people there, because that's where you're going to see social behavior. So there are two phases to this naturalistic inquiry. The first is what we'll call the exploration phase. This is the phase in which the researcher kind of becomes immersed in a particular or specific social world. So somebody studying body art modification might spend a lot of time in tattoo parlors and go to conventions where people talk about piercings and the technologies, but also the expressions of these various forms of body modification. In my case, studying homeless people meant immersing myself in the social spaces where homeless people kind of, interact with other homeless people, but also other members of the public who are not homeless, right? And sort of see their behaviors in the places where they occur, right? So observation rather than just interviews. So that's the exploration phase. It's maybe where you think about the place where you'll be gathering data. The inspection phase of naturalistic inquiry is when the researcher starts to analyze this qualitative data, right? So you start to code, you start to write up your notes, you start to look for patterns and linkages and connections, and it's a kind of a very time-consuming process. Also very, very immersive, but what you're immersed in here is the data, as opposed to previously, which is being immersed in the social environment itself. Just a quick word about ethnography. For those of you who do not know what ethnography is, it's a method in which a researcher is going to systematically but kind of unobtrusively observe a group or a setting, while joining participants in their kind of routine activities. When I say joining, I don't mean participating, but spending time with. There is there is a particular subset of observational sociology called participant observation, in which people might study groups that they themselves are part of. So it isn't just sort of an outsider observing the goings on within a particular social environment or a particular community. It might be, like somebody does, I might do an ethnography of university professors, in which case I'm not just, studying them, I am also one of them. So that would be participant observation. But most of the time when ethnography is conducted, the people aren't participating, they're just joining and observing. And that's where we get that that methodology. There's a particularly interesting variation on this naturalistic inquiry, specifically the two phases, right? The exploration and the inspection phases. And there's the researcher who's kind of responsible for this was one of those guys in the second Chicago school named Anselm Strauss, and he worked with a guy named Glaser, and they developed this methodology or this methodological approach called grounded research. Grounded research is a kind of research in which you're engaging in analysis and data collection simultaneously. So you would be in the exploration and inspection phases of naturalistic inquiry simultaneously. And the advantage of grounded research is that you can modify your assumptions, you can modify your set of questions, you can modify those aspects of life that you're going to be focusing on while you're immersed in those fields, right? The kind of an illustration of this would be, I go into the field in Chicago and I observe a particular set of behaviors among people who are homeless that lead me to start looking for different kinds of things than I started looking for when I first arrived in that social space. I'm using what I'm discovering to modify my process of discovery, right? And that means, that I don't postpone the inspection or analysis portion of the inquiry. I do that concurrently with the observation, and grounded research, or what we call grounded theory, allows people who are doing this kind of immersive research. It allows them to sort of modify their approach kind of on the fly. One of the things you want to be open to in qualitative research is something we call serendipity. We want to be open to things that we didn't anticipate before we went into the field, right? When you're open to discovering new things, and you can then, if you're nimble enough intellectually or methodologically, you can take what you discover sort of in an unanticipated fashion, and you can fold it into the work that you're doing, even as you're doing that work, and your research becomes richer and a little bit thicker and more nuanced as a result of that. So naturalistic inquiry doesn't have to follow a grounded research approach, but grounded research is one very interesting way to possibly do a kind of naturalistic inquiry in which you take the inspection and the exploration phases and you kind of do them simultaneously. So this one was going to be short. I hope that feels short to you. All right. Until next time, have a good one.